So in this video I'm going to explain what is rent to rent. So the rent to rent property strategy is basically you are taking a property on from the owner, the landlord, and you're going to re-rent the property for a profit. That's essentially what it is. Now, of course, there's many steps that come into play to understand the rent to rent model. Now what I'm going to explain to you is, and what you're going to understand from this video is understanding how rent to rent works exactly. All the steps and all the details that's included in the rent to rent model. This video is an introduction to the rent to rent model. So the rent to rent property strategy is where an individual or a company leases the property from the owner, the landlord, and re-rents it for a profit. So essentially, you're renting it from the landlord for an amount and then re-renting it for a higher amount. And the profit is what you take home. So you generate cash flow from controlling the property, not by owning it. You don't need to own the property to control it. The owner gives you full permission to rent it and own and control the property and generate a profit. So firstly, let's start with how rent to rent works. I'm going to start with explaining how rent to rent works, step by step. So firstly, there's an agreement between the landlord, as known as the owner, and yourself or your company, the individual, or the company who's going to take the lease. And the average normal lease term is between 3 to 5 years. And this is on a guaranteed rent basis. So you as an individual or your company is leasing the property from the owner for, let's say, 3 years and giving a guaranteed amount every single month as the rent to the landlord. Regardless if it's empty or it's full, the landlord still gets paid the guaranteed rent. Secondly, you need to understand that the rent is guaranteed to the landlord, the owner. So when a company or an individual guarantees the rent, they'll be paying the landlord regardless if it's vacant or it's full. So it doesn't matter if the property is empty or it's half full, you are guaranteed the rent to the landlord, so you're going to pay the rent every month for the guaranteed amount. Number 3, the responsibilities you take on as the controller of the property. The responsibilities of property management and maintenance you take on when you guarantee the rent to the landlord. So you take full responsibility for all minor repairs and the day-to-day management of the property. You take on responsibility finding tenants, you take on the responsibility to do the minor repairs, and you take on the responsibility to make sure the day-to-day handling of the property, of the tenants, is carried out. So defining what's a minor repair and a major repair, that's another video. You need to understand all this. But the definition of minor repairs usually is anything that's not structural, and also applies to major components of the property like the boiler, any fixed appliances. So in the usual case, you'll be responsible for all the minor repairs, and the landlord is still responsible for the major repairs and the structural repairs of the property. So number 4 is re-renting the property. So how are you going to rent the property out? The strategy you're going to use. Are you going to rent it out room by room? That's on a HMO level of rent to rent. Or are you going to go through the serviced accommodation route, which is more of a short-let serviced accommodation. You can rent on Airbnb, Booking.com, all the short-term rental platforms. So this is a different strategy, but it's still rent to rent on a service accommodation level. Or you can even rent it out as a single let for a higher rent amount. So you rent it out to a family for a higher amount than you're paying to the landlord. That's still rent to rent, but on a single let occupancy. So determining all of this, last but not least, is the compliance. Following the rules and regulations set in place by the local authority in terms of rent to rent or HMO rules. So back to the re-renting the property. If you're going to rent it out room by room HMO style, you're going to have to get in place all the compliance, apply for the local authority license, pay for that, and then you can rent it out and make a profit on it. For example, John, the landlord, the owner of the property, he's renting the property to you or to your company for £2,000 per month, fixed, guaranteed rent for the next 3 years. And then you rent the property out room by room on a HMO basis, and let's say there's 5 rooms in the property, and you achieve £3,000 a month. Now you pay John £2,000. The £1,000 is the gross profit. After that, you've got operating costs. You've got the utility bills, the council tax, whatever else costs, the maintenance costs. So let's say that's another £300 for operating costs. So the net profit you have left over is £700. And as long as the property is fully rented and everyone's paying on time and everyone's paying in full, you've got £700 coming in net profit every single month. Alright, so let's move on to defining who is involved in rent to rent. Number one, of course, is the landlord. He owns the property. He wants reliable, safe rental income from the property. And he wants hassle-free income from the property. He does not want to manage the property. He wants hassle-free guaranteed rent. So that's the landlord. Secondly, it's the rent-to-rent operator, essentially the individual or the company, like yourself. I'm going to define it as the rent-to-rent operator. You are the one operating in the property. You're controlling the property. And then number 3 is the tenant, of course. The tenant pays the rent, and the tenant is the final part of the puzzle. Externally, there is the local council also involved slightly, as you need to be compliant with the rules and regulations. So we move on to number 4. Number 4 is the types of rent to rent. There are a number of type of rent to rent. So there is a single let rent to rent, as I explained earlier. A single let rent to rent is on the basis that you're giving the property to one contract, to one unit, whether it be a family or a single person. You're giving one contract for the whole property, and you're charging a higher rent than the landlord is charging you. So the operator is charging a higher rent and making a profit after he pays the landlord. And then you've got HMO rent to rent. Backtrack back to single let. Single let is usually less profit margin, but it's also less hassle and less intense on the management, as it's one family or one tenant living in the property and not multiple. So there's a less profit margin but also less hassle. Then we move on secondly to the HMO rent to rent. Now this is the most lucrative and the highest profit margin. When you take the property on and you rent it room by room, so you have multiple occupants in the property. It will bring you higher cash flow, higher profit margin, but it's also very intense on management, as tenants in each room may have a complaint for you or have an issue in the property, and it's going to be a continuous management. So higher profit but higher management. And thirdly, you've got serviced accommodation, SA rent to rent, which is on the short-term basis, i.e. renting on Airbnb on a daily rental. Now this has the potential of having even higher profit margins. However, you have a very intense management and a cleaning, updating the property after every guest. It's very strenuous. So this strategy has a high potential of profit, but also is very intense on the management. And then you have the risk of void period. If the property doesn't get booked for a certain number of days, you may be just breaking even or a loss. So that's the three main rent-to-rent strategies. I'm going to go over the benefits of rent-to-rent. The benefits of rent-to-rent as a property investor and operator to get into rent-to-rent. Low capital entry, so you don't need a lot of money to get started. You don't need to own the property or put down a deposit for a mortgage. And also, this is the fastest way to get into property investing. You've got monthly cash flow, so the cash flow is coming in rapidly every month, and you're not waiting long term for a return or a profit. And it's also a scalable model, which you can perfect and repeat one property at a time, and you can grow your portfolio very quickly. But it is also a hands-on property experience, so you need to be ready for the hands-on experience. It's not always going to be passive. One property is different to another property. A property, you could rent it out on a HMO basis, room by room, and the perfect tenants move in. They don't give you any hassle, there's no maintenance issues, and you hardly speak to the tenant. The exact same property next door could be completely different. More maintenance issues, more hassle. But you get the property experience and the hands-on experience very quickly. So if you compare it to a traditional buy-to-let, you do not need to put down thousands and thousands of pounds as a deposit to buy the property and then rent it out. You do need some money, but for the first property, don't need a lot of money to get started. So it's a low entry point. So the risks and compliance rules and regulations you need to follow. Number 6, the risks and challenges that come with rent-to-rent. Everything has risks and of course challenges with it. So being prepared will help you to overcome these challenges. So we can start off, for example, maintenance costs. You may have some maintenance costs which you did not think about before, you did not anticipate, and that can happen. Void periods. Now this is a big one. Void periods is when the property or the room, if you're renting it room by room, is empty. So if you have a 5-bedroom property and you've got 4 rooms rented, but 1 room is empty, that 1 room may be generating you most of your profit. So the void period can eat into your profit. So that's one of the risks of rent-to-rent. And of course, rent arrears. If tenants are not paying their rent, or they're not paying in full, or even they're not paying on time, that will have a big risk and it's a challenge for you. Now, finally, market changes or the council's rules and regulation changes as they regularly update their rules. You need to keep up with it. That's one of the challenges. So rent-to-rent is not clearly a passive income. It can be, but it's not clearly a passive income. It's more of a hands-on approach. So number 7, the compliance and regulations. Number 7, the compliance and the ethical rules to follow. Firstly, of course, you need the landlord's permission to be able to re-rent the property. You don't want to go and re-rent the property where the landlord is not aware. You can get in a lot of trouble for that, and that will be deemed illegal. HMO regulations. You need to be, if you're renting the property on a rent-to-rent HMO strategy, you need to make sure the property is licensed. Either yourself, your company, or the landlord has applied for that license and is in regulation and following the compliance and the rules and regulations. Tenants' right to rent checks. Before you accept a tenant, you need to do the right to rent check as a part of the law. You need to make sure they have a right to rent in the UK. And of course, health and safety rules followed. Fire alarms in the property, fire extinguishers, fire doors, all of these elements of the property need to be in line with the rules and regulations. And then the contracts. So with the landlord, the owner, you need to use a commercial agreement rather than an AST, because you are taking on the property in permission that you're taking on the property with the permission that you are going to re-rent it. You are not going to live in the property. So you need to have a commercial lease agreement. And with the tenants, you give them the AST, their short hold tenancy. And of course, for the tenants' deposits, you need to make sure you're signed up with one of the government approved protection schemes. the deposit protection schemes, either TDS or DPS. And then if you are operating as a company, you need to be part of a ombudsman organization as a company. So the property regis scheme or the property ombudsman, you need to make sure you are joined with them so you don't have any issues. And of course you have as a company you need to also have the health insurance, liability insurance. As a company you need to make sure you are covered with the liability insurances and joining up to an insurance provider that will insure your company for any liability. So these are the main outlines of a rent-to-rent strategy and the different methods of using rent-to-rent strategy. If you'd like to learn more, hit subscribe and I'll see you in the next video.